thing, are you?
Hi, this is Penny. It's Tuesday night at 6:30, so it's time for What We're Reading. Tonight, we have with us Ada Township Planning Director Jim Farrow. Jim has been planning director in Ada for 20 years. Did I get that right, Jim? Is it 20?
Over 20.
Over 20 years. Okay.
I don't remember the year.
So
There's a reason for that.
he was part of Ada's transformation and part of the development of the library. Jim, what can you tell us about our new library that's going to be in Ada?
Well, it's about 75% complete, and the exterior is pretty much completed. It'll be 24,000 square feet inside. Wow. So not the biggest KDL branch, but not the smallest, somewhere there in the middle. And a unique aspect of the building is it has an enclosed central courtyard, an outdoor courtyard that will provide an attractive outdoor space, quiet outdoor reading space for patrons. And
oh no, I'm predicting kids playing out there, not completely quiet all the time.
Probably not. No, I'm sure it'll get kid use too. So it won't be always a quiet reading zone, but it can also possibly be a little small, intimate event space.
Nice. Now, Jim, how long have you been working on bringing a library to Ada?
Well, when we prepared our village, what we call our downtown, as we call it the village, when we prepared our village redevelopment plan in 2013, it identified the need for more civic amenities in the community as a means to bring people together, create more of a sense of a community in our downtown, and attract people to our downtown. And a library was one of the ideas suggested at that time for a new civic amenity that would do those things. And the idea of a library took some time to incubate and come to fruition. And in about 2016 or 17, the township board passed a resolution saying they wanted to create a KDL branch in downtown Ada. And
yay, boy. Jim knows how passionate I am about the library in Ada, and I could talk about that all night.
And Penny played a big role in bringing the vision to fruition by helping generate public support and enthusiasm for having a library in Ada.
Well, thank you. But tonight we're talking about what you're reading. So Jim Farrow, what are you reading?
Well, what I'm currently reading, I don't even remember the title of, and I haven't yet gotten far enough into it to figure out whether it's a trashy book or not. It might be, I'm not sure.
So what book are you recommending?
You probably don't cover trashy books on this segment.
We have no judgment.
Two interesting and very timely books that I've completed reading in the past 6 months are a book about the flu pandemic of 1918, which was the largest pandemic that we've ever had in the country, called The Great Influenza by John M. Barry.
Now that's nonfiction.
Of his other American historical books in the past, so I'm familiar with the author. He wrote another book about the Great Mississippi River flood I think it may have been in the 1920s. It was a very catastrophic flood on the Mississippi River. And it was actually published several years ago, I think in 2014, I believe. And so just reading about the history of the 1918 flu pandemic and the times that it occurred in and the impacts it had on the country and how the country responded to it has really been interesting in light of what we're currently going through. And I'd like to hit on some of the comparisons and parallels that I saw in reading that book.
Yeah.
The second one is also fairly timely. It's called The Color of Law, and it was also published a few years ago in 2017, but has gotten more attention in the last couple of years with the focus we've had on racial inequities in the country. And the focus of this book is about how the housing market in our country became so segregated by race. And the thrust of the book is that the racial segregation we see in our housing market today in many, many communities across the country was not just the result of people's individual choices on where to live. It was basically imposed by governmental policy and requirements at many levels, federal, state, and local, and that the government itself is responsible for, in large part, for creating the segregated housing that we see in till today. And I think that has relevance to the unrest we've seen over law enforcement and the consequences of interactions between people of color and law enforcement agencies. The slogans that we see between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, to me, tend to oversimplify what the source of our problems is in the country, and maybe identify some possible solutions.
Great. Those are definitely two very timely books right now. Which one do you want to talk about first?
I think The Flu, partially because I'm waiting for a flu test result, or a COVID-19 test, right? Result.
And I told Jim, coincidentally, I am too, because I have cold symptoms. So this is a very timely. Now, you're talking about the Spanish flu now, right? Is that what they called it?
It was called the Spanish flu, but that doesn't necessarily mean it originated in Spain. In fact, the most common view of epidemiologists today is that it likely originated in the state of Kansas.
Really?
Yes, and spread throughout the country and throughout the world, initially by troop movements in mobilization of the country's entry into World War I in 1917. World War I actually started in 1914, and for 3 years, the president, Woodrow Wilson, wanted to stay out of the war and really opposed entering into World War I. And after the war started hitting closer to home with the sinking of the Lusitania and other developments, he finally came on board after a lot of pressure from Congress and the public, and the U.S. became not an ally. We were not called an ally, we were called an associated power, and we entered into the war. There was a large military training base in rural Kansas that had like 35,000 troops at it, and it's believed that the virus came to that base from a small rural town in Kansas and spread in the base, and then spread throughout the country on troop trains. Troop trains would go on long trips from a military base to the East Coast as a point of departure to go overseas. And between the time the troop train left the station and got to its destination, there were dead people on the train that had to be removed.
But that fast. Oh my goodness.
While they were riding the troop train. And they were in very concentrated, densely populated settings, probably densely packed on the trains. And
would people be getting on and getting off at stations in between?
No, I believe these were dedicated troop trains.
Okay.
They weren't serving the public. Wilson, when he finally made the commitment to enter the war, even though he was initially so reluctant, by the time he made that commitment, he gave it everything he had, and he was single-mindedly focused on winning the war. And he went to great efforts to avoid any public distraction or messaging to the public that would be perceived as hurting morale and distracting the nation's focus on war production and mobilization and winning the war at all costs. And so there was very little information given to the public about the pandemic and the flu, and the public was kind of kept in the dark about it because he didn't want any distractions from focusing on victory, selling victory bonds. There was a large effort to involve the public in helping finance the war by buying small denomination bonds all over the country. Massive parades were held in big cities to promote sale of victory bonds. There were more or less neighborhood block groups focused on recruiting neighbors to buy victory bonds. And so that's where the nation's focus was.
So were these spreader events, do they know, these parades and these?
There was a notorious, what you would today call a super spreader event in Philadelphia. There was a large parade, a victory bond parade held to promote sale of victory bonds. And the public health officials in Philadelphia warned that there was a high risk of spreading the flu at that time. And by holding this event, they discouraged holding the big parade, but the public officials were pressured to go ahead with it and hold it anyway. And that had drastic consequences for Philadelphia. There were some real drastic measures taken by the federal government to keep that focus on winning the war and controlling information that was given to the public.
How drastic.
Well, there was federal legislation passed called the Sedition Act. He was very concerned about disloyalty, any disloyalty. And at that time, in the 19-teens and 20s, there was a lot of labor activism, and labor unions were suspected of being communist, and immigrants were suspected of potentially being disloyal. And so there was a big focus on maintaining loyalty in the country. In fact, one of Wilson's statements was, "It isn't an army we must shape and train for war, it is a nation." And he pushed a piece of legislation called the Espionage Act through Congress. And among other things, it gave the post office the right to refuse to deliver any written material deemed unpatriotic or critical of the government. So
wow.
Censorship of information through the post office, and the post office refused to deliver a lot of magazines, periodicals, especially the ones that were where the main audience was immigrant groups.
Mhm.
And since this was before television and radio, it was really the mail, which was the main dissemination of information to the public. So there was, I guess you could call that a form of censorship.
Oh, yeah.
Here's an interesting tidbit that will relate to you, Penny. And at that time, the Attorney General of the United States demanded that the Library of Congress report the names of persons who borrowed certain books. So
my goodness.
There was tracking of people who were tracking what people's borrowing habits were at libraries back then.
And they did that?
I believe so, yes.
Just at the Library of Congress or other libraries?
I don't know if that filtered down to other libraries or not, but this monitoring of people's activities definitely went down to the neighborhood level. In addition to that Espionage Act, there was a Sedition Act enacted, and the U.S. has had more than one Sedition Act. I think there was one it was either in Revolutionary times or World War I times, or Civil War times. But the Sedition Act that was passed in 1917 or 18 made it illegal to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government.
Okay, I want to know, how do they define scurrilous language?
Right, you and I both.
Because how does all this come back to the flu?
It comes back to the flu in that information about the flu and was seen as distracting people from being focused on winning the war. I think that was.
Would information in the mail about the flu be censored by the post office?
Well, there was also concern about anti-war sentiment and people who were resisting the mobilization to go to war. So I don't want to say it was entirely the flu.
Right.
FBI didn't exist yet at that time, but there was a predecessor federal law enforcement agency that was charged with organizing a volunteer citizen group called the American Protective League that had at one time had 200,000 members in over 1,000 communities across the country. And it was basically a volunteer citizens group, kind of a vigilante group that would report people who were suspected of being disloyal or opposing the war effort. Since we were at war with Germany, persons of German descent were very suspect. And some states went so far as to enact legislation prohibiting teaching the German language in their schools. There was that kind of paranoia in the country.
Oddly, my grandfather was German and fought in World War I for the United States, but his parents had just immigrated. I think, was that a way for him to show his loyalty, or was a lot of that going on?
You know, he very likely may have experienced prejudice either before or after he came back from the war, assuming he did come back from the war.
He did. Purple Heart, but he came back.
You know, President Wilson also urged Congress to pass legislation authorizing censorship of the press, but Congress wouldn't go along with that, so that wasn't put into effect. The Congress drew the line at that. So instead, the federal government created an appointed Committee on Public Information, it was called, the CPI. And that committee was basically a journalism group, a group of journalists that wrote hundreds and hundreds of news stories that they would then distribute to newspapers, that newspapers would print verbatim, without any editing or scrutiny. And in essence, the newspapers practiced self-censorship. They didn't want to print anything that might hurt public morale and distract attention from the war effort. So the news media didn't cover the flu pandemic very much. So in that sense, it was very unlike today, where the media are probably overly focused on the current pandemic. And I think some of our political leaders probably wish they weren't so focused on it, obviously. But in 1918, the government was focused on it, and they pressured the media not to publish a lot of information about the flu, and the media toed the line back then.
Gotcha. I'm going to put you on the spot, and you don't have to answer this because I would not remember it if I had read the book. But do you know what the numbers were like in the United States? How many cases, how many deaths?
Well, there were estimated to be 30 to 50 million worldwide, but I don't recall the numbers in the United States.
Is that cases or deaths?
I believe that was deaths worldwide.
So that's enormous.
And that pandemic went on for 2 years. The second year, 2019, was worse than the first year, 2018, and it didn't taper off into 2020. And some communities had their worst, most deadly experience with it in early 2020. For example, in 8 weeks in early 1920, there were 11,000 deaths in New York and Chicago alone. And that was like in an 8-week period. New York City during that time in early 2020 had more cases reported in one day than any day that they had in 1919. So their day was in 2020, not in terms of number of deaths, not in 1919. So it stuck around for a long time and then tapered off gradually. There are stories in the book about there was no national mask mandate, but there were local mask mandates in some communities.
Oh, really?
There was organized opposition to mask mandates in some cities. The masks then were gauze masks, so I don't think
kidding.
They probably
that was readily available everywhere.
They wore gauze masks. And interestingly, at that time, medical science was just emerging and getting away from the days of quackery medical science. And they referred to, early on in the pandemic, they referred to it as a miasma, just something that was in the air. And as scientific research regarding the pandemic advanced, they didn't know whether it was caused by a bacteria or by a virus. And they didn't figure that out until after the pandemic was over. The cause was not known at that time, and a lot of the research that was done really provided useful information that carried over into the post-war period when DNA was finally discovered. Some of the early science that was done in the 20s led toward the discovery of DNA when they finally figured out that the flu was a virus.
Gotcha. Now I'm going to ask a librarian question. Is this a book that is tough to get through? Is it very dense? Some nonfiction, is it just full of dates and facts, or did you find it a good read?
It's a good read. It's a better read than The Color of Law is. I think The Color of Law is a little bit drier, and but still filled with a lot of interesting information. But it's the descriptions in the Great Pandemic about how the flu spread through communities and how quickly people succumb to it are just horrible. How people reacted to it. The the fear that the public had because they had no information, and the author at the end comes to the conclusionary statement that the worst thing for the government to do during a pandemic is to not be truthful, because lack of frankness and honesty and telling truth about what's going on just breeds mistrust when correct information comes out, and mistrust leads to the attitude that you can't believe anything you hear.
Right.
So I think it's basic, just during the current times we're in, it's really a fascinating book to read.
Yeah, hold it up one more time, Jim. We can see it.
It's on my Kindle, so I have to turn it on again.
Oh, that's okay. Just tell us the name and the author again then.
The Great Influenza by John M. Barry.
There we go. Great Influenza by John Barry. Excellent. Did you check that out on your Overdrive app?
I think I originally, I don't remember because I end up buying Kindle books, but this may have been during the transition period when you were going from Kindle or from Overdrive to
From Cloud Library back to Overdrive.
Right. And the subtitle is The Story of the Deadliest Pandemic in History.
Hopefully it will continue to be that.
The book he wrote about the Mississippi flood was called Rising Tide.
Okay, now tell me, I'm really excited to talk about your next book, The Color of Law, because I've got a hold on that one. There's a little bit of a waiting list on that for on my Libby app. Show me that one, The Color of Law. Who's the author on that one?
Richard Rothstein.
Now, this is particularly a good book for you to talk about, Jim, because you're a city planner.
It's really relevant to a planner.
Tell us how so.
You basically learn that planners and zoning, their initial mission was to enforce racial segregation in the housing market in the early 20th century.
That was their purpose?
The times of the 1918 flu pandemic. The author has some qualifications. He's a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and an emeritus senior fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The thrust of this book is that segregation in the U.S. housing market didn't just result from people's individual choices about where to live, both black and white choices. It resulted in large part from governmental policy and regulation at federal, state, and local levels. And that's those policies enforcing separation and really carried forward all the way from the late 1800s into around 1960 or so, when racially restrictive covenants in subdivisions were finally outlawed and no longer permitted to be enforced. I need to grab some notes here. in the early part of the 20th century, local governments actually adopted zoning rules that were outright racially based, that basically required segregated white housing areas and segregated black housing areas.
This is all over the country?
It was fairly widespread around the country. I don't know that it was, I don't believe it was necessarily uniform everywhere by any means, but it was common.
Okay.
These were eventually struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917. The housing market, developers of housing, got around that striking down of racially required separation of zoning in a couple ways. First of all, governments, instead of having explicitly racially separate zoning areas for white and black housing, develop zoning rules that achieve the same result through other standards, such as very large lot size requirements or very large minimum housing requirements. And that practice has really carried forward in a lot of communities, and probably in my own community, up until the present time. And the genesis of separating housing styles by size and type and lot size really originated as a means of achieving racial segregation by another means instead of explicitly. In fact, in the early 1900s, after that 1917 Supreme Court case, President Wilson, the same president who brought the country into World War I and fought the 2018 pandemic, appointed a federal commission, an advisory committee on zoning that developed model zoning regulations that were distributed widely to local governments throughout the country, that had a model set of standards for zoning regulations that became widely adopted by local governments. And that model ordinance started this practice of separating housing by type and lot size requirements and minimum housing sizes. And so it spread throughout the country. And in essence, it started out as a facsimile for racially segregated zoning. And that was documented in the book by quotations from statements that members of that federally appointed advisory committee made in their process of developing the model rules.
They were pretty explicit about their intention?
I think it came out in statements that were made, that were quoted in the book. In addition, after that Supreme Court decision in 1917, developers started putting restrictive covenants and deed restrictions when they sold homes in new developments that prohibited, by an enforceable private deed restriction, the sale of a house, a resale of a house to, in almost all cases, Black people, and in many cases also to immigrants, members of certain immigrant groups.
Specifically written into the deed.
And written into the deeds, yes. And I think particularly for people of my generation who grew up in the 1950s and whose parents purchased housing in the early years following World War II, when this practice was still very prevalent. It would be interesting to go back to the deed language in the home I grew up in the 1950s to see if it contained one of those racially restrictive covenants in the deed, because they were very common all around the country. So that enforced segregation. Those deed restrictions for many years enforced uh, segregation in housing until they were declared unlawful by the court system. The government became complicit in enforcing segregated housing when the Federal Housing Administration and the VA were created and established standards for VA loans and FHA loans. And those loans originally required restrictive covenants, racially restrictive covenants in the FHA-backed mortgages. Those agencies enforce those requirements in their loans to home buyers. The FHA also had a program where they issued construction loans to developers to develop large new subdivisions to finance the construction of streets and utilities and initial home construction. And as a condition of approving development loans to developers, the FHA required developers to have racially restrictive covenants in the deeds to the homes they developed in subdivisions. The classic post-World War II housing development that you learn about as a planner in reading about planning history is Levittown in New York, which was a huge post-World War II subdivision that had racially restrictive covenants in it. The impacts of those practices that carried forward all the way to the late 1950s is that African Americans were largely not permitted to enjoy the benefits of home ownership. They were forced into being renters.
And is this something that was widely known? I mean, would your, say, parents or grandparents realize this was in their deed? Is it something that, I mean, were we all complicit in this, or is this going on behind the scenes?
You know, I certainly didn't know about it growing up. I know I eventually learned about racially restrictive deed restriction practices somewhere along the way, and maybe when I was in college. Whether people knew about it when they purchased homes, you know, I saw my deed when I purchased my home, so I think it was probably pretty well known.
Gotcha.
And when you think about it, the building up of wealth through home ownership and the transfer of that wealth from generation to generation has benefited people of my race all along the way. You know, my parents inherited homes from both of their parents, which they were able to put into housing that they purchased, and were able to do move up buying into larger homes.
And not only that, it gives you an economic security if there's a horrible thing that happens and you're out of work, or a nest egg to send someone to college. I mean, it gives you so much more than someplace to live. It gives you a financial security.
Yeah, what I realized from reading the book is that oppression of people of color didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. It continued through the 1800s, through Reconstruction, and into the 20th century, and through quite a bit more than half of the 20th century, in terms of people of color having the benefit of widespread home ownership and building the wealth that transfers from generation to generation by owning real estate. And so it sounds
like an eye-opening book.
Natural defensive-ness by us Caucasian people against charges that Black people are still oppressed and are disadvantaged, but we're still suffering from the measures that were in place through not just 200 years of slavery, but all of the years that we've had post-slavery up until the 1960s, and that there's a legacy of inequity there that needs to be addressed somehow in the country.
So I think it's a very important read. I didn't know about it. You're saying you as a planner didn't really know about it, that it might have been in your family's house deed. So, I mean, it's a good way to open your eyes about what's been happening.
I have a planning certification from a national credential group that I had to pass an exam for, and I have to maintain certification for. And in studying for the initial test I took, there was a planning history book that I read that where I learned about the initial development of zoning regulations, but I don't remember any reference in that book to it being initially racial segregations, the racial segregation motivation that led to it. And I never realized until reading this book that the community planning profession was involved in those early efforts to enforce racial segregation through zoning.
So very important read. Thank you for bringing both of those books. Show us the last one more time, Jim. The Color of Law.
By Richard Rothstein.
Excellent. Very important read. Want to let everybody know that next week we've got Catherine Behrens from WZZM joining us to tell us what she's been reading. And stop by the Ada Library when we open up to see myself, and hopefully every once in a while you'll see Jim stopping in. It was nice seeing you tonight, Jim.
Our opening is scheduled for late January, opening to the public.
Excellent. Can't wait to see everybody.
Just a few months away.
Yay. Have a nice night, everyone.
Thanks, Penny.